All right, welcome. We are going to look today. We're going to continue our verse by verse through Matthew 24. And we're going to kind of pick up today, transitioning into question number 2. So if you remember, there were 3 questions. Jesus says, not one stone is going to be left on another. And they say, what is the sign that these things will happen? And then they say, what is the sign of your coming? And what is the sign of the end of the age? So up until Matthew 24:34, Jesus says, all these things must take place in this generation. So we've been answering that first question about the fall of Jerusalem. I think you're going to see today that the answer to the second question also comes before Matthew 24:34, in that section of things that have to happen in that generation, that is that first century generation that Jesus is speaking to. It's only when we get to the third question that he starts answering that one a little different. So I guess we need to start with, what does he mean, or what do the disciples rather mean by what is the sign of your coming, right? So this is the one that has been taken out of context probably the most. And it's what leads so many people to think that Matthew is dealing with what we would consider the end of, the end of everything. Because in, the last 100 years, people have preached so many times from pulpits, oh, you got to be ready for the coming of Jesus. And so when they hear the disciples say, oh, tell us about your coming, everybody immediately thinks, oh, second coming, these are the signs. And that's really where the kind of the heart of the misunderstanding has come. And so we're going to look at that today. And I've told you in a previous video, there's no way that they're asking Jesus about what it's, in today's terminology, is the second coming of the Lord. He hasn't died yet. He hasn't risen from the grave. He hasn't ascended to the right hand of the Father. They don't even understand Jesus is going to die. So this is before that. So after this, he dies and they're shocked. And then after that, he rises from the dead and they're shocked again, And then he ascends to the right hand of the Father and leaves them and they're shocked again. They didn't expect any of this. So at this point, they're not asking about that. So I guess we need to go back and kind of figure out what were they expecting, right? So let's read a little bit here and just have this in our minds. So we're going to be in Matthew 24, verse 29. It says, immediately after the tribulation of those days. So again, Jesus is calling that period leading up to the fall of Jerusalem by that phrase, tribulation. And I think you'll find that word tribulation in the Bible is only attributed to things that deal with the fall of Jerusalem. And I think we said in the last video that Jesus is real clear that is the highlight, the climax, if you will, of tribulation. He said, when he's answering that question about the fall of Jerusalem, he said it won't be anything like that before, there won't be anything like that after. So a lot of that teaching that is teaching, oh, there's clearly a terrible period of tribulation in the future of the church, I think you got to throw that out. All right, so he says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. One thing that we're going to have to do is, anytime you're dealing with interpretation, translation from Greek or Hebrew into English, if you know what happened, it's much easier, But when you start getting into things that are prophecies, then you got to kind of the interpreter has to make some decisions, right? So we've talked about one of those is particular for the book of Revelation, where there's several places where it says, say, a third of the earth will be burned up, right? Well, that word earth is also the same word for land, and it just depends. As the interpreter, the translator, whoever's writing out the version of the Bible that you're reading, they have to make a decision. Are we going to say that this prophecy is about burning up a third of the planet? Or are we going to say it's about burning up a third of the land? And it gives a different impression, because if you say the land, then all of a sudden it makes it seem like it's talking about Israel. If you say the whole planet, then wow, this is something cataclysmic that has never happened before, and it has to be future. When you say that an army from Rome is going to come in and burn up a third of the land, then all of a sudden you say, well, no, that did happen when Rome came in and destroyed. And that's not necessarily something for the future. That seems clearly like something that already did happen. And it gives two totally different impressions, right? And it's the same underlying word. And so I think we're going to see in Matthew 24 here that there's like 3 or 4 decisions that translators have to make on this passage, and it really comes down to, what do you think he's trying to say? If you think he's trying to talk about his second coming, which I'm telling you, there's no way they're asking him about that. If you think he's talking about a second coming at the end of everything, then you're going to make decisions in your translation to reflect that. If you think he's talking about the fall of Jerusalem and things that are about to quickly happen, then you're going to make some translation decisions to reflect that. And I think most of our translations in the last 200 years have all been very future-oriented. And so they word these things in a way that it becomes like a self-fulfilling or self-edifying kind of loop there, that you say, oh yeah, I think this is talking about the future, and then you go back in and read it, and they worded it in their translation to make it sound like it's going about the future, and then you just have to put, well, see, look, it says right there, clearly this is about the future, and it kind of becomes this loop. And if you understand that there was another way to read some of these things, then it wouldn't. Then you say, well, maybe that's not what that's talking about at all. All right, so let's get into it. First of all, we need to figure out what would the disciples be asking Jesus at this point when they're talking about his coming, right? So one of the first things is, let's go to Acts chapter 1, right? Because they see Jesus rise from the dead. And this is Acts chapter 1, verse 6. So Jesus has risen now. And so they had an expectation. And I'll just let the cat out of the bag of what I believe they're talking about here. When they say, tell us about your coming, the whole Old Testament teaching of the Messiah is that he's going to reign on the throne, that he's a king in the line of David. He is. And so when they're saying, what is the sign of your coming? If you're the Messiah, you need to be sitting on the throne. You need to be reigning. Now the difference is, and one thing that a lot of people have seen down through the years, is that the Jews in first century Israel are expecting the Messiah to reign on an earthly kingdom right there, potentially in Jerusalem, just like David did, and be seated on the throne and to rule and reign and overthrow Rome. Everybody's expecting that. Everybody's expecting the Messiah to overthrow Rome, right? That's part of why John the Baptist was sad, is because here Jesus is and Rome's still in charge. John the Baptist is still in prison because Jesus, who's the Messiah, still hadn't overthrown Rome yet. So, what's going on, Jesus? Is somebody else? Do I need to wait for somebody else? That was the expectation, even among godly people, was that, all these prophecies in there talk about David's kingdom is going to reign forever, and there'll always be one sitting on the throne, and there's this special one that's going to be the Messiah. He's from the line of David, and when he comes, he's going to make everything right. And the disciples are following Jesus because they believe that's who he is. They are thinking that Jesus is going to overthrow Rome. He's going to be that king, and that's why they are shocked when he dies. And then when he resurrects, then like, okay, game on. We're back in line here. And we get to Acts chapter 1, verse 6. Jesus is risen from the dead. Hey, that's even better. Now we got a supernatural king, right? Back from the dead. David never did that. And we got, it was fine. It was a little strange at first to see you die, but now that you're back, I could see why. Okay, now we're ready. Now we're going to overthrow Rome, right? That's the way everybody's thinking. You can see it right here in Acts chapter 1, verse 6. Therefore, when they had come together, they asked him, saying, Lord, will you at this time, now you're risen from the dead, will you restore the kingdom to Israel? And he said, it's not for you to know the times or seasons that the Father has put in his own authority, right? So, it's a way of saying no, and it's you're not going to know. You're not going to know ahead of time exactly how God wants to unfold the future, right? That's not for you to know. So, but the point I want to emphasize here is, even at this point, they're still waiting on Jesus to be an earthly king and to overthrow everything. So let's go back to Matthew. But so when they're saying, Lord, what is the sign of your coming? You're the king. You're the one we've been waiting on. We're waiting on you. Come into your throne. Come into your power. Come into your kingdom. Sit on this throne. Overthrow Rome. Rome's in charge now, but when are you coming? Right? You're the king. When are you coming? You say, okay, you're going to overthrow Jerusalem. You're going to get rid of all the people that are here. You're going to destroy all these buildings. That's fine. We don't care if you want to start over fresh. So what's going to be the sign that you're going to destroy all this stuff? And what's going to be the sign of your coming? Right? And so I do not believe at any point that they are thinking he's going to die and leave, and that they're going to have to wait for a long time and need a sign of when he comes back. That's not the type of coming they're talking about. They expect him to be a king who's going to reign from the earth, and they're saying, when are you coming? What's going to be the sign of your coming? They use that word parousia, which is specifically about a king that returns from battle and is seated back on the throne. It's his victory celebration for expanding his kingdom, and he's coming into his kingdom. And they use that specific word parousia because it has royal overtones to a Caesar or a king coming into their kingdom, right? And so, Jesus says, hey, I'm destroying all this stuff that you see here. Fine. When's that going to happen? And when are you going to sit on your throne? When are you coming to reign as king? That's what we really want to know. And so this is his answer, right? And I think there are some translation decisions in this Matthew 24, verses 29 through 31, that make it kind of skews what he's actually trying to say, right? And so, and I guess let's get into it here. So let's lay some foundation about the phrasing of the coming of the kingdom, right? The coming of the Son of Man. If you ask anybody today just about, not you guys once you've watched this, but just you ask most people, what's the coming of the Son of Man? The coming of Jesus, they're thinking end times, the very end, when Jesus returns, comes back for the church. But let's go to Matthew 16, verse 28. Matthew 16, 28. Jesus says, assuredly I say to you, there are some standing here who shall not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. So Jesus is standing right there talking to his disciples. And he says, there's some of you that are going to live through the coming of the Son of Man. So clearly, he's not talking about the same thing that many people today are talking about when they talk about the coming of Jesus. He's not talking about the very last day at the very end. He's talking about something else. Talking about something that's going to happen while the disciples are still alive. Because I don't think you could come into this saying, oh, Jesus, the way some people take this. If you read commentaries, there's a lot of commentaries out there that say, oh, this is just an example of Jesus' humanity. He didn't know. He thought his kingdom was going to come sooner, and so he's telling these disciples they're going to see it, and he was just mistaken. That's an awful way to go about taking this. I think the better thing is Jesus knows exactly what he's saying, and what people think he means by the coming of the kingdom needs to be adjusted. What does he mean by that phrase? You'll see the coming of the Son of Man. All right, turn with me to Daniel chapter 7, and let's take a look, because that coming of the Son of Man that's taken from a prophecy from the book of Daniel, right? Daniel is one of the last prophets. Jerusalem's already fallen. Solomon's temple was destroyed by Babylon. Daniel is now living in the aftermath of that in the Babylonian Empire. And he's one of the last prophets to prophesy before that long period where you don't hear much in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. There's about 400 years where we don't have much written in Scripture. And Daniel, though, is one of the last active prophets. So he's almost, if you will, the apocalyptic book, the end times book, so to speak, of the Old Testament. You know, he's one of the last ones to prophesy. He's prophesying about things to come. So for them, the book of Daniel was actually how a lot of people take Revelation today, that it's a book about the end, even though we'll get there, and I think most of it is not about the end. But many people today look at Revelation and think, oh, that's about the end times. Well, that's how, first century Israel would have thought about the book of Daniel, right? Talking about things to come. The Messiah is going to come. Daniel sees these prophecies of these four beasts, right? And he gets the interpretation that there are four kingdoms that are going to come between the time of Daniel and the time of the Messiah. And so one is the kingdom of Babylon. That's the one that's currently there. Then they're going to be destroyed by the Persians. The Medes and Persians unite and destroy Babylon, and they reign for a while. That's Xerxes and Esther and all those things. Darius the Mede, when Daniel's thrown into the lion's den, that's different than the Babylonians. It happens in those same cities because the Medes and Persians come in and wipe everybody out. And so that's a new king, and he doesn't know Daniel. And so he's just destroyed Babylon. He doesn't know who Daniel is. So he gets thrown in to the lion's den. And then God, saves him, and all of a sudden now Daniel has a very strong relationship with this new kingdom of the Medes and Persians. And then Darius's son, then later, is Xerxes, and that's the king of Queen Esther. And so the Persians come. But then the Persians, they keep trying to battle with Greece and everything, and eventually Alexander the Great comes in, and he defeats the Persians, and so you get this whole Greek Empire for a long time, all the way up until right before the time of Jesus, 50 years or so before Jesus, you get the Romans coming in and conquering the land of Israel. And so you get these four kingdoms that had authority over Israel between the time of Daniel and the time of the Messiah. But all the prophecies of Daniel are in that fourth kingdom, that fourth beast. You're going to see the Messiah in the coming of God's kingdom. I think that's why Revelation chooses the imagery of the beast to describe Rome, because it's described as the last beast in the book of Daniel. And so a lot of Daniel is going to be important for us. So we may spend some videos just going through some of these visions from the book of Daniel. But Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. He says, I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. And he came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. And then to him was given a dominion and a glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. They should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed. So it's clearly talking about the Messiah who's going to come in that fourth kingdom, because there's other prophecies about that fourth beast is going to come, God's kingdom, and it will not be destroyed. But listen to what he says. So Daniel, this is where we get the coming of the Son of Man. That's why we're reading this one. He says, behold, one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven, and he came to the Ancient of Days, to the throne room of heaven, right? And this is where so many people miss it, because for first century Israel, reading the book of Daniel as their apocalyptic literature, the coming of the Son of Man is not someone who's coming from heaven to earth. It's someone who's coming from earth to the throne room of heaven, right? And so Jesus says, there's some of you standing here who will not die until you see the coming of the Son of Man. The coming of the Son of Man is when One like a son of man from Daniel takes his place in the throne room of heaven next to the Ancient of Days. And we would call that the ascension of Christ, right? After, Acts chapter 1, after Jesus is resurrected from the dead, Jesus is taken to the heaven in the clouds, and he goes to the Ancient of Days, and he is now seated at the right hand of the Father. That's what Daniel sees in his vision. One like a son of man coming from the earth to the Ancient of Days, and takes his space there in the throne room of heaven, and to him is given dominion and authority. In other words, he's reigning from the right hand of the Ancient of Days. All authority and dominion was given to him. So what does Jesus say right before his ascension? All authority on heaven and earth has been given to me. Go therefore in my name, right? And so that's the whole picture. He's quoting essentially from Daniel, saying, hey, the coming of the Son of Man is when one comes from earth, goes to heaven, and he's been given all authority, he's been given all dominion. And now I'm telling you, I have all authority and all dominion. And what's the next thing we see? He's taken into the clouds of heaven, to the Ancient of Days, to the throne room of heaven, right? So, the coming of the Son of Man in first century is two things, kind of. Two ways you can take that. Number one is this prophecy of Daniel, where the Son of Man is reigning, and whether first century caught this or not, but he's reigning from the throne room, right? He is the king that's going to last forever. He is the king with the undying kingdom. He is the Messiah, but he's not reigning from the earth. And I think a lot of the first century, they missed that part. But they understand that the Messiah is supposed to be a king, and he is supposed to reign. Right? So Jesus has not missed any of that. So in Matthew chapter 16, verse 28, when he says, some of you standing here will not die till you see the coming of the Son of Man, he's not talking about the second coming when he comes back for the church at the end of everything. He's talking about his ascension, going from earth, coming to heaven, and reigning on his throne from the right hand of the Father. And then the other part of the coming is, as we talked earlier, the disciples are convinced that Jesus is going to reign right then with them. Because remember, the two sons of thunder, right? John, the disciple, his mother comes and says to Jesus, hey, can you grant my two sons to sit on either side of your throne, right? And so what are they saying? We know you're going to be king, and when you come into your kingdom, we want to be your right-hand man, right? And so here we have, not long after that, when they asked for that, that was this same general passage. Right before that is when they're asking, Jesus, we know you're about to come into your kingdom. We know you're about to be king. We want to be in there. So when Jesus says, hey, I'm going to destroy all this stuff, they want to know when that's happening. And when they say, hey, what's the sign of your coming? They're not talking about at the end. They're thinking Jesus is about to be king right now. And that's good for us because we're his right-hand guys. We've been there with him. When he's king, that means we're kind of like sub-kings. We're like the next in line to the king. And, there's a lot of self-interest in that. They want to know when are you going to sit on this throne? Because, hey, that's good for us too. And so I think that's the best way to understand that passage. We are running out of time in this video. So I'll make a second one. We'll pause here. We'll pick back up with that thought. And I think we may even have time to jump into the third question. And maybe we can wrap up this teaching of Jesus here.